I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is The Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
So on today's podcast, we're going to interview Dennis and Kasia Beck. Dennis and Kasia have served for 42 and 45 years respectively with what I knew as Campus Crusade for Christ, which now goes by the name of Cru. Their early ministry years were in Poland in the mid-70s and 80s. And now if you remember, Poland in the 70s and 80s was a communist country. So you might wonder a couple of things. How did they get permission to do ministry in a communist country? Or maybe the bigger question, why did they go to Poland under communism to do ministry? Well, we're going to let Dennis and Kasia answer those questions during our interview and hear more about their story.
You know, what's amazing, this story isn't just a story about doing student ministry in a communist country under some very hard circumstances. It's a story about marriage, loss, hope, and trust in the sovereignty of God. So I think when some people think about missions and missionaries, they think that when someone gives their life to God to serve in cross-cultural missions, God gives them special blessings, and they are spared from the ordinary things in life and the heartbreaking things that life can bring our way.
You know, in today's interview, you may hear some things that challenge your preconceived notions about missionary life. But I'm going to let Dennis and Kasia tell their story today. I know what you will hear is a story of God's sovereignty, faithfulness, and care. So we'd like to welcome Dennis and Kasia Beck to the Innkeepers podcast today. Dennis and Kasia have served with Cru. Many of you know is now the name of what was Campus Crusade since the mid-70s. Many of their years of ministry were in Poland. They've also lived in Budapest, and currently, when they're not locked down by COVID-19 restrictions, they're traveling and ministering in Central and Eastern Europe with FamilyLife, a ministry of Cru.
So Dennis and Kasia, welcome to the Innkeepers podcast, and thank you for agreeing to be on our show today.
And we're glad that you guys are here. I just wanted to let our listeners know that our family met your family in Budapest in the late 90s. We were busy doing youth ministry training, and you guys were just living up the road from us and serving on staff with Cru. We attended a church together, and much to Dennis's chagrin, our families ate many a Sunday meal at the Burger King that was on the way home, which was never Dennis's first choice, but it was easy, it was quick, and the kids could run around and play outside. And I know our kids played by the hours on that playground. And when we visited each other in our homes, the kids really enjoyed playing with one another. Will you take a minute and just kind of introduce us to your family?
Sure. I guess I'll start. We have 3 children. All 3 of them are married, and our oldest is Kelly. She and her husband, Matt, live in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and where she works as a doctor, family practice doctor, and we have our first grandbaby about 7 months ago.
Yay.
So, and then Jeff and his wife, Kelly, or Casey, we call her, live here in Ohio where we are. And he works in medical billing and coding. So again, medicine. And then our son, Brian, and his wife, Carissa, are in Fridley, Minnesota. And he works as an office manager in a mental health clinic. So we're still waiting on kids, grandkids, but we're excited to have our first grandchild too.
That's exciting.
There's a strong medical theme going there.
There is, yeah.
Wow. Must make family Thanksgiving meals a little interesting.
Definitely, yeah.
Yes. So, can you share with us about your ministry in Poland in the 70s and 80s? How each of you got there, and why did you go there? And, how was it even possible to do ministry in Poland at that time?
Maybe I'll start first since I was the first to move there. Well, for me, it started, I was actually a student doing a senior year abroad in Vienna, Austria, and traveled to Poland. And at that time, God just put a prayer burden for Poland on my heart. But little did I know that a few years later, after I came on staff with Campus Crusade, that he would open the door to actually move there. And I've been praying for several years, specifically for Poland. But obviously, we couldn't go as missionaries. And yet the call was very strong. And at 25 years of age, or right before I turned 25, I was able to move to Poland as a student. I applied through the Department of Education, and I didn't speak any Polish, but went and spent about a year and a half in formal language learning, and then went right into the University of Warsaw, where I was to study. I actually applied to study Polish history. So that's the formal way that we went to Poland. But the beauty of it was I was a student as well.
Yes,
so it was
you
great.
really were learning.
Yes. I went to classes and had a dorm room, and what a great way to interact with students, and just way of life, sharing Christ, and having Bible studies, seeing students come to know the Lord. So it was, in real essence, it was student to student during that time. So I'm before that, both Dennis and I had traveled to Poland and worked in Polish youth camps at different times in southern Poland. I started there in 1976, traveling in. There was a huge Catholic youth movement that was going on, and we were invited, Campus Crusade was invited by a Catholic priest to come in, because he said, you Protestants really know the Bible better, and what our students need is the gospel. Come and teach us. Come and teach us how to show the students how they can know Christ, and teach us how to share the gospel. So we were able to do that every summer in these camps, where thousands of students went through these summer camps.
Yeah,
What an open door.
It was.
That's great.
My journey started when I was actually a professor at Cal Poly State University, and that's where I met Campus Crusade as their faculty advisor and so forth, taught there. And in my third year, I heard about this hush-hush project into Poland in the summers, working in these youth camps. So I went in 79, and then I came and led the project the next year in 1980, along with another staff member. And because I was an associate staff member at that point of Campus Crusade, which meant I was volunteering. I wasn't earning a paycheck, because obviously I had income from elsewhere. But in the 1980s, when I took 10 students from my campus, along with many other people from around the country, and we went into various Eastern European countries, but most of my students from Cal Poly went to Poland. And that's when I saw the power of faculty member having students and actually working with them. And one of the interpreters in our camp in 79 was a woman named Eva, was invited to come to the United States in 1981. And this is when I got married in 1981, not to Kasia, but you'll hear that story later, is that Eva came to us to be trained at Cal Poly. And my first wife, Betty, trained her. And it was during February of 1982 when Eva said to me, Dennis, what's keeping you from coming to my country?
Wow.
When I began to think about it, I realized somebody else could be teaching at Cal Poly. And but perhaps I was trained enough to be able to, go and for a period of time, go into Poland. So in 1982, shortly thereafter, that question, I felt led to, I had an encounter with God in my office one Saturday or Sunday writing a test, and it was forever life-changing. The call came, and it was very clear. And I was already tenured. I had already been promoted to an
Wow.
associate professor. There was no earthly reason to leave, but God had very clearly intervened and said, go.
Mm.
Wow.
So I showed up in Poland in 1983 in
Wow.
June,
Yeah.
and that's when Betty and I first met Kasia. So
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And Kasia, I was just thinking when you were talking about there being a student and living in the dorms, and so how did were the other students kind of eager, like they were interested, like you were a novelty in some respects. I mean, here you are, a Westerner in Poland under communism, which is most people would want to be in America, and so did they kind of enjoy helping you with language, kind of enjoy asking you questions and learning about life in the West?
I think they were curious. Many of them wondered just that very thing. Why are you here? Because they all wanted to go to the West.
Yeah.
But I told them that, I had visited Poland back in 1975 and just fell in love with the Polish people. And when I said that, they go, oh, okay. Yeah, now I understand.
Yeah.
Because, there are people who have a very love for their country. And they are a very warm people. And somehow that made sense to them. So
Okay.
then it was like, okay, I get it. But it was really hard to explain to them we also had talked about, we would not talk about anything political.
Uh-huh.
So it wasn't really a comparison type of a thing, but I would tell them, because I grew up on a farm, so we would talk about what the difference in farming was in America and in Poland. But then we'd also talk about the similarities, and that's where you could really get in the gospel, that people had the same basic needs and the same basic desires, and that's where we needed a spiritual solution to our problems.
Oh, well, it sounds like it created a great open door for you.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So, Dennis has alluded to kind of the next part of our story, or the next part of our conversation here. And so Dennis and Kasia, I'm going to let you sort of tell the story now from the early 80s up to 1990. And this is the part of the story that we really want our listeners to hear today, and we want them to hear about God's love and faithfulness and God's sovereignty. That's kind of the theme that we keep coming back to in this podcast, is the sovereignty of God and the goodness of God. So you guys have an interesting story to tell, and we're just going to sit back and let you guys talk for a few minutes, and we'll try not to interrupt, and we just want to hear this story.
Well, I'll maybe start out in the sense that I had been in Warsaw for several years, and in 1983, I was asked to move to Krakow to help with the new campus ministry there that was going on. And that was the exact year that Dennis and Betty had moved there. And obviously, for me, being a single woman, very far away from home, it was really a gift to me that they opened up their home and treated me like a member of the family. And when each of the children came along, Kelly first, and then Jeff, Kelly in 85 and Jeff in 88. They called me in Polish. They called me their auntie, and so and I could come holidays. When I was through in the dorms, at that point I lived off campus. I could drop by and have supper with them. I mean, I was just part of the family, and that met such a need as a single woman in my life. So, and Betty and I became really close friends. When we would have staff meetings, or Dennis and I, who were leading the ministry, and she spent a lot of time with the kids, I would say, well, let's have the meeting in the kitchen, so that Betty could be a part of it, and because she was so involved and so excited about what we were doing. So we were a close-knit team.
I think one of the highlights of that period was actually we were asked to invite Josh McDowell, if anybody knows him, to come and actually do a 3-night series in Krakow, Poland. I hosted him when I was at Cal Poly twice, so I knew that what he was capable of doing and everything else. And so I was placed in charge of that along with another Polish pastor. And the incredible things that happened during communist period was that he recorded 13 of his messages in the Polish television studio. And we had
Wow.
staff there. I mean, we had students and everything else attending in this.
A live audience.
Because
yeah.
it was kind of, and it was going against the big threat of the communists there, which was the Roman Catholic Church. Second thing was he did speak those 3 nights, and it was an incredible experience. It was the first time he'd ever done that series in a communist country, and it was just really changed my life as far as seeing God work and believing. But at one point, the secret police had on the radio, they were looking for me because I had dressed up along with another one of my student disciples in masks, carrying sandwich boards
on campus.
Advertising. And we would go stealthily into the dorms and put little pieces of paper under the dorm rooms. But it created quite an interest.
And we had 2,000 students to follow up after those meetings. So.
More than we could handle.
Yeah.
Like a little revival.
It was, but that was really, the great blessing before a lot of hardship came.
So I think what the real question you're really boiling up to is that we still did ministry as 1/3 of our time. Our assignment was you spend 1/3 of your time in your cover, because all of us had covers.
Yeah.
I was actually been invited to teach horticulture there for a while, and then gravitated over to working on a doctoral work. It was all my cover.
Right.
I always enjoyed the fact that when I was teaching, I was being paid by the Communist Party to teach there in Poland as a missionary. And of course, they had to have known, but it was just, the ironies were incredible. But so 1/3 of your time in cover, 1/3 of your time in ministry, and the other 1/3 of your time was just existing, because you can imagine for even the most simple things, all our food was on ration cards, and it wasn't just being rationed that was the insult. It was then you had to go stand in line or
For
multiple
hours.
lines
Yeah.
to get that food on those ration cards. So we learned to live, in a different way, and it actually profoundly affected us all the years, because we learned to understand what others go through, and we were also the simplicities of life.
Yeah, you were there, and you were very much identifying with them in almost every respect, because you were living under their system, you were living under their laws, and having to subsist and exist just like they were.
Yeah, and I right before Dennis and Betty had arrived, actually it was in December 13th, 1981, when the Solidarity trade union movement was brutally crushed and martial law was declared, which means all civil law was suspended and only military law was in place. And many people disappeared off the streets. Some of our students were just picked up off the streets and put in prison. And so we feel that very deeply, and December 13th will always be a very meaningful date. We relate so deeply with the Polish people in that those who lived through that, it was a life-changing experience. So we really did identify with them and with their struggles, and I think I learned so much from the Poles as well, of how to rejoice in the simple things in life, how to enjoy one another. And some of our deepest friendships were forged during those years.
Plus the political humor. It was the best. It was the best.
They
That's
made
the
the
equivalent
best.
of a Polish joke.
They made the best political jokes that you could imagine.
I mean,
Yeah.
So,
So let's just kind of, so you've made reference to in 81 and just what at that point was kind of the beginnings of what might have been a change, but it was crushed. Now let's fast forward a few years to 89 and 89 and 90. And just from your perspective as being there in the country, talk a little bit about the changing political climate, and then we're going to come back to your story here in just a second.
Well, things were slowly changing. The resistance movement did not really die away. And Lech Wałęsa, who was the leader of the Solidarity movement, and others actually had what is known in Poland as the roundtable discussions with the Polish authorities in June of '89. And that led to the very first free elections where non-communist party, the actual, I guess you would call it the Solidarity Party, were allowed a certain percentage of seats in the Sejm, or which is the equivalent to the Polish parliament. Mm-hmm. So the very first free elections were held, and that was revolutionary. And then in the fall of that year, that's when other countries, the Berlin Wall came down in November of that year, and Hungary cut the wires. Actually, it was between them and Austria in, I believe, August or September of that year. Ceausescu was outed and murdered actually in December of '89. So it was that incredible change in the country, but still the very same people, even though change had come, down on the local levels, the very same people were running the local offices, and the police were the same. So it really took a long time for actual change to take place. But by 1990, change was in the air for sure.
What a time to be there in that country. That would have been mind-blowing in some ways.
Yeah. I know we had a staff member in Romania during the fall of Ceausescu, and he has some actually very harrowing stories from that time, but it was crazy.
It was a very unique time for sure.
Amazing. Well, let's jump back to the family story. Dennis, you were in Krakow teaching and working on your doctoral research, and Betty had traveled to the States with your two children, Kelly and Jeff, and then just let's pick up the story from Betty's return back to Poland.
Well, on the morning of July 6th, she returned right into Warsaw. I had driven 5 hours during the middle of the night from Krakow to Warsaw to pick them up around 8 o'clock in the morning. And the first words Betty said to me is, "I don't feel good." And so I said, "That's fine. Let's get the kids in the car, in the back seat, and then you just lay down in my lap and I'll drive home." So everybody was sleeping. Everything was fine. Got home. We went out for just a quick bite to eat at a local joint. Came home. And I was actually out talking to two of our student leaders who had come to my house. Again, nobody had phones back then except us and a few others, but nobody could call you to set up an appointment. You just showed up. So these two guys showed up. I'm out talking just outside before the front door, and all of a sudden my little 5-year-old now, she just turned 5 the week before, comes running to me, Daddy, is Mommy joking? She's laying on the floor." And I said, "No, I'm sure she's not joking." And I excused myself, walked into the house, and on the table was Jeff, who was a day shy of 2, and she had been changing his diapers, and she was just laying on the floor already ashen gray and, so forth, and fought back, obviously, the temptation to think she's dead. I checked for breath, air out of her nose, checked her pulse, nothing. And so then, wouldn't you know it, this 3-day period is when the phones didn't work. And I had one of the few phones in Krakow. I couldn't call the ambulance or anybody else to do it. So what did I do? I picked her up, tried to. She weighed all of 105 pounds, and we used to do a lot of jitterbugging, and I used to throw her all around me. But darn if I could pick her up at 105 pounds of dead weight, literally. And I took her out to the car, had to lay her down in the grass because I had to back the car out of an extremely tight tar paper type of covering garage. put her in the car. The two guys got on the back seat. As we were trying to drive to the...
And the kids were with the upstairs landlady.
Oh, okay.
And then on my way, I checked her again. She was in the front seat with me, and I just checked for pulse, checked her breathing, nothing. I said to the guys, check it. They wouldn't do it. And I said, okay, that's it. And I just, 3 blocks away from my house was the militia station. 2 months earlier, they started calling themselves Polizia. So that was part of the fall of the wall, was the new name change, same people.
Yeah.
2 of the 3 officers I talked to were drunk. I could smell the vodka on their breath. I asked, can you go down and check? You know, is she dead? Because I think she is. Yes, so forth, so forth. I happened to go back to the car because they told me to get the documents, and I happened to just reach across her belly because she was still in the car, and I felt the money belt. She had still had the money belt with all of our US dollar cash and so forth, and all these kind of things on her. And I quickly just kind of slipped it off of her and stashed it. But anyway, the point is, the 2 guys were there. They were my witnesses because the police had been manhandling me thinking I'd killed her. So obviously that was not the case. And I was released. And then the next day, 5 policemen, actually, I was surprised it took an extra day. They came the next day to check over the house. They saw, you know, a little bit of blood on the floor, which was from the drainage out of her ear. And, you know, this type of thing. They checked all the medicine cabinets thinking that, you know, maybe some drugs and whatever else. And basically that began a process with the district attorney to make sure that, anyway, that's a whole story in itself. But so that's, my life changed. The next morning, about 3:30 in the morning, because at that time of the year on the very eastern side of the time zone in Poland, the sun comes up. And, you know, I'm out walking the streets in the rain and having a little conversation with God and wanting to make sure that I understood whatever this was about. And I came away with 2 things. One, I knew God was still sovereign behind everything that happened. I didn't understand it, and I didn't understand why I had to go through it, because my mother had died at the age of 39, and my father, basically the same age as me, is going through the same thing, and I'm at 37 at this time, 38, I guess. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, do I have to go through the same thing he did? And but I had a different tact because I knew God was sovereign, and I had to count on that multiple times in the next month or so. And that's the part of the story why I would love to, you know, unpack for people, is that God is still good in the midst of death.
Yeah.
So
Betty, can you just clarify, because I've never heard this story before. So Betty, she had an aneurysm or something. Do you even know what caused it?
Well, they did an autopsy, but of course at that time in 1990, the word deep vein thrombosis was not known, or at least was not published, or not in the you know, common vernacular of everybody. But we think now that that was definitely what had happened, is blood clots by sitting on the plane all night, not moving, and so forth. The clots, which she had a tendency to do, even though she was pencil thin, the clots went to her lungs, and therefore she had that very quick death of lack of oxygen and so forth. So I'm sure that's what it is, but I have no proof. But if you want to read the autopsy, I've got a wonderful 13-page in Polish.
In Polish, yeah. Yeah.
I'll pass. I'm sure you all wondered what had happened. Like, how is it this is possible that just so quickly she's gone? So I'm sure there are questions for all of you. And it's so hard and sad that you were in that political environment where every action you took was questioned so deeply. So that too has got to have been scary.
After the stop at the police station, did you go on to the hospital? Was that eventually?
No. They wouldn't let me go anywhere. They took me in the back room, and that's when different things happened to me. So
Yeah, back rooms, communism, kind of, yeah, those,
It wasn't that drastic. They
yeah,
didn't string me up or
yeah,
anything, but I'm just saying that,
yeah,
the old tactics and the old ways of dealing with things
yeah,
physically and so forth
yeah. It was,
hadn't changed.
hadn't changed. That's right. So, if my math is right, Dennis, you and Betty had been married for 9 years. You had two children, and you were deep in ministry in Poland together. Betty had just returned from that time in the States, and now you guys, you and the kids traveled back to the States, and I'm assuming then Betty's body was transported back to the States, and there was a memorial service for her so that people could gather and mourn with you. And so just kind of tell us a little bit about that time being back in the States and just the sudden shock and surprise, everything having unfolded like it did.
We got on a plane, actually the old Pan Am, and in the bottom of the plane was Betty's body. The kids were there along with another couple that had been asked to travel with me back to the States. Got back to the States, and wouldn't you know it, we arrive in New York. The eeriest thing was my daughter says to me, "Daddy, that was the same stewardess on our flight the day Mommy died."
Wow.
And this is when you're just, in transit in a big old airport like John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
So we went up to her, and sure enough, she recognized Kelly, and we told the story, what had happened, and to Betty and all that. But it was just like, wow, that's interesting. And went on. We buried her in Omaha, and then had the service there in the same church where we'd been married, all that kind of thing. And then I went out to California and did two memorial services there, both in San Luis Obispo and then also in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so that was, interesting. Of course, everybody expected me to come back to the States at that point.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
you've got to come back. My poor mother-in-law at the time, well, those kids need a mother. And I said, Mom, don't put that on me or yourself, because they won't get a mother until I know I need a wife, and that's too soon.
Yeah.
But I had the experience of watching my father go through it. And I just remembered things happening to him that I just said, I just hope I don't have to go through all of that type of stuff that he did. And so I had the benefit of watching him go through it. He said a couple things. One that's germane to today, he said, everything turns out for the best. And the second thing he did say that is also germane now that I think about it, was that whatever you do in that first year, don't make any drastic decisions, big changes.
Yeah.
So exactly a month after Betty dies, so about 2.5 weeks after her internment in Omaha, I'm in California, and I get a phone call. I had actually been 5 hours away from my kids in San Bernardino at Campus Crusade's then headquarters.
Yeah.
And it was my first time to begin thinking, what's next? What am I going to do? And I got a call on that Sunday morning, and I'm only away for 3 days, but I get this call from somebody I've never met. It's a doctor. And he says, basically, Dennis, if your 2-year-old son doesn't respond here in the next 20 minutes, we're going to have to put him in the hospital. He's got asthma. And can you believe it? I get off the phone. Well, I said to the doctor, I said, does this mean I need to come home now? I mean, I can't even believe I said that, but it was just the honesty that came as a result of death. There's just no filters.
Yeah.
And which, by the way, I don't know if you're going to say anything about this, but there is that article that Campus Crusade did on our family that obviously it's a PDF, but it journeys that whole year after Betty's death. But I say that I come back to, the doctor and I hang up with each other, and I just scream in the hotel room of the Campus Crusade thing, God, you cannot take Jeffrey's life too.
Yeah.
About 40 seconds later, all of a sudden I'm finding myself out loud saying, oh, yes, you can.
Wow.
Because God, you're sovereign. Even though I don't understand it, I don't want it, but I have to believe that you still are sovereign. And I'm going to cling to that.
Yeah.
And that, my friends, was the lowest point I've ever experienced, was the thought I was going to lose my son as well. So I go back to San Luis Obispo. All this is recorded in that article, and
Yeah.
some of the pictures and so forth. And I get back, spend the hot night in the hospital. It's his third night in the hospital, and I'm just going, I've never been so low. And I came home and said to our good friend who was watching the kids for those 3 days, and I said to Robin, Robin, I now can understand how some parents can actually kill themselves and their children to end the pain. And of course, she thought at first maybe I'm communicating something, and I said, no, Robin, I'm not there, but I know how low I still can go before I've gotten to my low point in my life. And that's one of the nice blessings of this, is that things keep coming at us as a family and so forth, but it's never as low as that. So again, the depth of pain and difficulties can be a marker to us. One, God is still sovereign. Two, it can get worse, but it can't get too bad. And that's part of the take home for me. So
So you walked through a really deep valley during that time of incredible pain and loss. Yet it sounds like you, deep in the core of your being, still knew God was sovereign and clung to that to give you hope. Because it's, when you were looking at your circumstances, it felt like there was no hope. But that's an amazing, that's the rootedness of your faith in God that carried you through.
Well, I'm no perfect person for sure.
No.
I've got plenty of scars. You spend 15 minutes with me and you'll see them. But
It's
the point,
it's the goodness of our God that He is that trustworthy.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow.
So after the time in the States, which included the trauma of sorts and just the sadness and heartache of actually the memorial services that you had, the 3 different services, the episode with the asthma and how scary and just heart-wrenching that was, then I think you probably surprised a lot of people by getting back on the plane and heading back to Poland with 2 small children. And I think that probably shocked a lot of people.
Yeah. There are a lot of decisions I guess I've made in life that people think I'm crazy. When I left the university, they all thought I was crazy. I couldn't tell them where I was going and all this kind of stuff. I became Mr. Mystery.
Yeah.
And but it was like, just as God called me to Poland, He hadn't released me from going back to Poland. And I just found myself saying, I just want to go home.
Yeah.
Home had become Poland.
Right.
And therefore, it was like, I'll go back for a year and figure it out. What's next?
Yeah.
And there's probably stability for the kids, too, to go back and be in Poland again, because that's what they knew.
Well, either way, no matter what we were going to do, life was going to change. Whether I stayed in the States or went back to Poland, there was more familiarity for everybody back in Poland than there was, obviously, in some place in the United States. So, but it took an awful lot of effort just to pick up the phone and try to make reservations with Pan Am for the return. It's just like the energy level, the concentration, is obviously not there. So that's what had to happen. So I got on the plane with the 2 kids and the photographer from, the magazine, because they were chronicling my life, and I'd agreed to do that for a year.
We will. I will make an effort to track all the links to that down and link that in with the podcast too, so people can see that. Because when I actually read through that again and saw the pictures, and it's just moving to see the images from some of the images that were recorded from that year.
Yeah. So you got on. So you made it back to Poland, and Kasia, you were there, and had you seen them since they had left? Like, that was all a whirlwind, I'm guessing.
Yeah, actually, I was in the States raising support or deputation that summer. And so I got a phone call actually from a colleague in Vienna who was on our team telling me of Betty's death. And it was just so surreal. I mean, here was, one of the people I felt closest to, and it was just surreal. And I was at home in Minnesota, my sister's wedding actually, and then the next morning I got in a car and drove down to Omaha for the viewing or the visitation and the funeral. So I was able to be at the funeral, and it's true that funerals aren't for the dead, funerals are for the living. And it was something that we all needed for some kind of closure and to be together. But I saw obviously how hard it was going to be for Dennis. And so realizing the kids were actually in a difficult situation too, because their dad wasn't able to be himself, have the same energy level, focus, and with the grief he was going through. So I said, would it be helpful, since I know the kids so well, if I stayed for a few days and you could do whatever you needed to do with, official documents and things, and I'll just babysit. And I was staying with a family friend. And so I'd go over every day they were staying at Betty's mom's, and I'd take the kids and we'd go to the park, or we'd, go for a walk or a playground, just do something with them. And it was therapeutic for me just to love on them. Gave Dennis a few days, and I'd, bring him back for supper, and just kind of helped everybody. There wasn't the commotion of two kids around, and the kids were having some fun. But I remember one conversation as Dennis took me back to where I was staying one evening, and he said, I need to talk. I go, okay. And so, I don't know, we had a cup of coffee or something, and he said,
It was Village Inn. We were having pie and coffee.
Yeah. Anyway, he said, I just want to know that, our relationship can't be as it has been before. I'm thinking, what is he talking about? And he just said, well, it's just because, now I'm single and you're single. And I'm thinking, I've always been single.
It wasn't very tactful. I had no filters.
Yeah. But he was trying to figure out, that this felt weird. So all of a sudden for me, I was thinking, okay, not only did I lose Betty, but now I'm going to lose Dennis as a friend. Yeah. And so I'm saying things like, well, can I come and visit the kids? I mean, I just didn't know what was going on. And, and then he goes, well, yeah, but, but we just can't be like friends like we were before. And, so that, again, I felt like, okay, I'm losing even more. And, the reality dawns on you. Yeah, things are changing. So when I went back to Poland, I actually wasn't surprised that he came back, because it was home. It was home for all of us. Mm-hmm. And that's where our support system was, our friends, our life. Mm-hmm. And at that time, I'd actually just moved to Warsaw, and my ministry was more to travel to each of the campuses and supervise. And so that meant that I could travel also to Krakow. Mm-hmm. But I'll go back a little bit. As I was dealing with my own grief, I visited with a very wise friend of mine, Nay Bailey, who's also on staff with Campus Crusade. And I just said, I just don't know how I'm supposed to be in this situation. How do I respond? And she said something very wise. She said, when people are grieving, oftentimes their friends don't know what to say. They don't know how to act. They don't know how to be around them because they're uncomfortable. Therefore, they retreat. Yeah. So the most important thing that you could do is just be there. Mm-hmm. And I said, but he said we can't be really friends anymore. And she said, what people need most when they're grieving is that their friends are around them. Uh-huh. Yeah. And so in a sense, she was saying, yeah, but he needs everyone who has been his friend not to desert him and to be there.
Okay.
So I took that to heart. And every time I would take a trip to Krakow,
Mm-hmm.
I would call up and say, hey, I'm in town. Can I take Kelly bike riding on Saturday? Or can I take the kids to the park?
Uh-huh.
And he'd say, sure. And then he started saying, well, why don't you come on over for pancake breakfast on Saturday before you go? Sure, I'll do that. And what I saw is people literally, because they were uncomfortable with being and didn't know what to do with someone who was in such grief
Yeah.
and had experienced such loss, he was being abandoned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, would it be helpful if you just had someone to talk to? I can call you on the phone. And so I began calling him also on the phone. Just literally, I listened. That's all I did, because he just needed to verbalize. And people were afraid of saying the wrong thing, and so they avoided him.
Yeah. So they didn't say anything at all.
They didn't even come because they felt they had to say something. Whereas if someone is grieving, they just need you to be there.
Okay.
Not even, you don't have to say anything, just be there. And so with the wisdom of what my friend had said, I moved into that situation instead of feeling fearful and backing away and leaving him isolated.
Yeah.
The two most common things we've spoken on this many times, is two of the most common things that happen is people are afraid to say something because they're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing.
Right.
Yeah, probably will say the wrong thing. I've got to tell you, the funniest story was at the funeral. Right after it, I'm walking out in the parking lot, and somebody I don't even know about my age said, Dennis, I know how you feel. And I said, really? Did you lose your wife? No, I lost my dog.
Whoa.
And I go, oh, yes, you do understand, was my comment. The grace of God was incredible in my life. I mean, at that point, just could speak that way instead of chewing his head off.
Yeah.
And, so the point is that has been a part of it, is that people are going to say the craziest things, but it's okay. Better to say something than nothing.
Okay.
And the other part of it is that they just, they don't know what to say.
Yeah.
So they feel the awkward silence.
And they avoid you.
But that's what Kasia was just saying, better your presence. And we call it now the ministry of presence.
Okay.
When you go to a grieving situation, is practice the ministry of presence. It's not about what you say, it's just about being and saying and being there. And so it's very powerful. And so it just happens. So it increased the loneliness in sense going back to Poland.
Right.
Because the Poles were younger than me.
Yeah.
They hadn't experienced this. They didn't know what to do. The Americans that were there, they didn't know what to do. I mean, it happens. But it would have happened in California, and it would have happened probably even more so in Oregon.
Right.
That's a former Californian speaking to Oregon.
Yes.
So.
Well, if you had stayed in the States, there would have been so many adjustments, finding a new home and settling in. And like you said, settling in around people that really didn't know you. You were back in Poland, at least people did know you. The kids had a sense of familiarity. And so I think those kinds of things, although maybe some people didn't understand those choices, were probably the best choices for your family.
And Kelly went to kindergarten, Polish kindergarten. So she had friends, and she, it was, and she went a half day to kindergarten. And Dennis had a lady come in for a half day to take care of Jeff every day, a Polish lady.
Yeah.
And then things were cheap in Poland. So even had a taxi driver come and get Kelly to take her to kindergarten every day.
Yeah.
So,
those kinds of things.
So you had a support system in some ways that was already set up in Poland.
Mm-hmm.
So that first year was just kind of unpacking the story. It sounds like your friendship too. You were, Kasia, you were able to be there for Dennis because of
that was totally platonic, at least for the first 6 months. And all of a sudden I woke up one day and I thought, my goodness, she truly is my best friend now. I mean, it's like And then all of a sudden I opened my eyes even further, but I never talked about it on the tapes that I was recording for this magazine article.
Yeah.
I was pretty careful to just kind of not go there about too much about my feelings in this area as they started to grow. And so anyway, it was about friendship. And as I say to her all the time, you're just my favorite companion, but she's also, you know, a very dear friend, and of course everything else that goes with that. So
yeah. Well, tell us a little more of the story from 1991 then, because you're kind of intimating at moving, you know, a change in the storyline here. So just share a little bit more about that story.
Okay, so Betty died in July of 90, and now fast forward, it's the springtime in 91, and my friends, one of the friends, he's actually the president of Denver Seminary, but anyway, one of my good friends, Mark Young, and his wife Priscilla were good friends with Betty and me, and so they were the ones saying, let's go skiing together, it'll be good for you to get away, and some others. And so we went out for this usual skiing holiday, you know, usually in February's. And Kasia and all the single ladies were off in some other place, and these marrieds with kids had their places, and so forth. And so for 4 of the 5 days, I'm sitting having cabin fever with 2 squirrely kids, you know, and it was like, I don't want to be here.
Yeah.
I'd rather be home because I have everything normal here. This is terrible.
Yeah.
But I was able to convince somebody to watch the kids, I think it was the Youngs, for 1 day. And we went skiing, Kasia and I did.
Go skiing with them that day.
Yeah.
And so we went up on the mountain, and basically I just said, I know it's going to take you a while, but I'm ready to talk about the future, and you know that I am committing to that. So it came fast, a lot faster than I would have expected, but it was that turning point of realizing she was my best friend, and we've known each other for years. She knew Betty, that was important to me. She knew Poland, which was that experience in my life, all these things that it just checked off. And all of a sudden I woke up one day and realized it was her. And but I knew she needed some time because she was very active in the ministry, had a lot of leadership, had a lot of, you know, commitments as a single person at her age, everything to work through. All of a sudden, it's one thing to take on 2 kids, but it's even harder to take on somebody like me, which is really her oldest, 3rd child.
Yeah.
And so she, you know, it took her a while, about 2 months.
So what was that like for you, Kasia, when he said that on that ski trip?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're sitting on top of the Alps, you know, and all of a sudden he's talking, and Dennis is a verbal processor. So I was used to him verbally processing, and all of a sudden he says, you know I could live without you, but I also know I don't want to. And I go, what do you mean?
I said that?
So, you know, as we talk further, I realized, you know, he was actually talking about marriage sometime in the future. And I said, well, he said, it's okay. I can wait. I'll wait up till 2 years, you know. I'm thinking, I go, wow. And I thought, okay, this sort of turns our relationship in a different direction. But I also realized that he too was, you know, in terms of men, he was like my best friend.
Mm-hmm.
And so but I did have a lot of questions in my mind.
Yeah.
And I wanted to hear from the Lord. So basically I just began to pray and continue, you know, our conversations, and I continued my ministry and my travels, but I prayed fervently. And I also began to dig in the scriptures for some of the questions and asking the Lord to lead me. And over that period of time, every single question that I had, God just began to answer it. And he even brought back to mind something that I had said to one of our Polish staff women. We'd gone on a walk, and she was at that point, you know, in her late 20s. I was in my late 30s, and she, you know, they'd look up to me and they'd say, well, it's hard being single. do you ever think you're going to get married? Because they looked at me as somebody really old at that point. And I remember saying, Hanya, God knows that I'd like to get married someday, but I know he's also called me to this ministry in Poland. So I need to leave that to the sovereignty of God. And I need to trust him with it, because God is good and whatever he does will be good. But I can imagine him someday, God will lead me to some widower and I'll probably get married. Thinking someday when I move back to the States, when I was 60 years old or something. But God brought that conversation back into my mind, and almost like he was saying, you see, it's sooner than what you thought it would be. And so there were just many ways that God confirmed to me. And I remember a trip down to Krakow, and I knew I was going to tell Dennis that the Lord had really confirmed in my mind that he was calling me to a new calling. And that was to be his wife and the mother of his children. And I think he was kind of surprised that it came that early. It was about 2 months after he had said that, but God was just very clear to me. And we thought, first of all, we talked with our leadership. I don't know, this was probably April by this time, but we really didn't talk to people or tell people about it. And prayed until we got to about a year from the time period that Betty had died.
Right.
It was a Polish custom to wait a year and to be in mourning. I wasn't going to walk around in black and wear a black armband, but I was at least going to honor the culture in which I was in.
Right. Yeah.
So, and we decided actually sooner was better than later. Not necessarily for our sake, but for the children's sake.
Yeah.
And so we literally landed in the U.S. and
early July,
sometime in July, and
so almost a year later.
So almost a year.
Later, it was about a little bit over a year later.
Yeah.
Got in the car and drove to Omaha
with her mother and her sister, the two kids, and I in the car, and we're driving down to Omaha. And Betty's mom was actually going through some surgery at that very moment we arrived, and we knew that. And so we go into this hospital waiting room, and here's all my supporters and a bunch of people that know Julie Duxbury, and I'm walking in with all these extra women, and they're wondering, what in the heck are you doing? I didn't say anything. And they ushered me back to where Julie Duxbury was in the recovery room. I go in and say, Mom, I want to talk to you about something. And she was still delirious a little bit, from the medication. And the hospital asked me to wheel her gurney up to her room. And so I got to do that. And that's when I told Mom, that I was going to get married. And she goes, great. Let's get the pastor in here right now.
Let's do it now in the hospital.
in the hospital, of course.
Yeah, so she was probably delirious, but anyway, it was just neat that she was so affirming, because she'd already knew Kasia's parents, but she didn't necessarily know. Well, she'd met Kasia, but...
Yeah, we had actually, Betty and I thought, when we were such good friends, that we wanted our parents to get to know one another. So we had connected them. So that was just the Lord's providence as well.
Well,
so then you got married that summer? I didn't even know all the details. You know all these details.
No, you get the details.
Our listeners don't know.
Yeah.
So
August 31st.
We put a wedding together in about 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that's a quick turnaround there.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah, that was nothing short of a whirlwind, I'm sure, putting that together. And so where was that wedding?
In Almalund, Minnesota, which is, I call it a village of about 100 people.
It's a hamlet.
Yes, a hamlet. But what's interesting is that we got married on the 31st of August, and by the 14th, we were already had the children had been adopted by Kasia in this little county and so forth. They actually, the judge and our attorney gave the judge the article that we've referred to that had just come out the week before,
Okay.
gave it to the judge, and the judge turned to the people there in the court and said, can we make this thing happen today instead of waiting 6 months to go through the procedure? After he had interviewed Kelly and he had interviewed me and so forth in the courtroom. So it was like
God
in
was at
14
work.
days,
Yeah. Wow.
she got an adoption. And then 2 days later, we're on a plane going back to Poland and the kids are hers. I mean, it's just like
Wow.
God went before
God
us.
was in that.
Yeah. Wow.
That's amazing.
And you returned back to Poland, and I'm sure there's a lot to tell there about getting back and arriving as a married couple, and then just getting reintegrated back in the society and your network of friends at that point. Wow, that I just imagine there's a lot happening there.
Yeah, I think we really actually, in terms of first few years of marriage, we feel like it went so smoothly. And part of that is because when you've been through hard times and difficulties, you don't worry about the little things.
Yeah.
And so we felt like it was all uphill from here.
Yeah.
And we really had some great times those early years.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And then you had a third child, it sounds like.
And Brian was born in 94. So we were married in 91, and Brian was born in March of 94. So then there were three.
Yeah. That's quite a story. It's an amazing story. And I hope when people hear this story, they really hear your heart, and they hear the story of the marriage, the loss, the hope, and the trusting in the sovereignty of God, which is kind of the phrase we keep coming back to in this podcast. So as we kind of move towards wrapping things up, I'm gonna ask Dennis a question, and then Kara's gonna ask Kasia the same question. And it's Dennis, what do you want people to hear in this story today?
Well, I think unlike for many years, I wanted to believe that as a Christian, life was going to be full of all sorts of positive things, and everything would go well if you walked uprightly with him.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. The Lord doesn't promise us that. What he does promise is, I'm going to be with you all the time.
Yeah.
And so he was. And I would say the closest I've ever been to the Lord was during that first year when I was all alone. Without doubt, because I couldn't do anything without having conversation with him.
Wow.
And, between focus, what's the next thing the kids need, what's the next thing I need to do around the house. I mean, it was just, there was just something special about that, but also that was tough. I'm not ready to want to go through that again, but at the same time, it was there. So God promises us that what he's going to give us is good. So I have to treat that even in death and the journey of grief and everything else, it's still good. Doesn't make it easy, doesn't make it lack of pain, but it does make it good. And that's where the hope comes from, is that someday or some period of time, things are going to change, but the sovereignty part means that God still is in control of everything. And that's what goes along with hope. And it actually goes along with the goodness, because all of these things are promised. But he didn't promise us just this life that was going to be without any problems. And that's the thing I think I fell into the trap of thinking.
Yeah.
And I'm every once in a while I have to catch myself on that too. It's not about my upright living or doing the right things, but it's God and his character that is really the important thing. And that comes back to his attributes. And one of those is his sovereignty. So
Great.
Thank you. So Kasia, what would you want our listeners to hear from your story today?
Well, I think for me in my journey in all of this, first of all, it's always the right thing to say yes to God. Through the difficulties, when I think of going to Poland under communism as a single woman, and when I think of the difficulties that we face, the losses, God is sovereign. But when we say yes to Him, He does promise to be with us and to bring a blessing. Again, I think it's those hard times when we get the closest to the Lord. And it's the easy times when we think we can handle it ourselves. And then we can mess it up pretty badly too.
Yeah.
So the goodness of God, the sovereignty of God, and the hope of God, we need to say yes to those things all the time. And He is true to who He says He is.
Yeah. He's faithful.
Amen.
Yeah. I think that's part of what I heard in your story is God's faithfulness to both of you in living in a communist country and living with tremendous loss and all those things. You guys both continue to see God's faithfulness in your life, and that has been the bedrock for you guys.
Yeah. And I think what I was hearing too is that you both made decisions at certain points in your life where other people certainly didn't understand. People didn't understand leaving a tenured professorship. People didn't understand probably as a single woman moving to a communist country to enroll in school and, to do ministry that way. And so certainly there were a lot of things that people were probably very confused about. But you continued, like you said, you continued to say yes to God. You continued to follow and listen to His voice and do what He asked you to do. And you saw His faithfulness every step.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I have been super encouraged, so thank you. And you've lived this. It's not just some story you made up, so it's sure had a lot of, there's a lot of things you guys have had to process over the years. But I pray that this will be an encouragement to our listeners, many who have walked their own journeys of struggle and suffering and on the mission field and off the mission field. And we're just hoping that they too will be encouraged to see God's faithfulness to them.
So Dennis and Kasia, we just want to really thank you for taking the time to be on the Innkeepers podcast with us today. And our prayer is that as people have listened to this story, today they'll hear about God's faithfulness to His servants and His care for His servants, and they'll just really be able to rest in that and rest in that trust, just truly trust in God for His sovereignty. Thank you again.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
That was an amazing interview we had today with Dennis and Kasia, and I was just, I had heard part of the story before, but to hear the whole story, and it was great. Tell me some of the things you heard today, Cara.
I was just really encouraged by each of their walk with the Lord as God took both Dennis and Kasia to Poland for different reasons and different ways. They got there, independent of each other, and then how Dennis lost his wife Betty, and just that story and how vulnerable he was with just that loss and how that affected him and being a single dad. And wow, that is quite the story. But how God and His sovereignty and how he clung to God's sovereignty.
Yeah.
That was just amazing to me. And how God brought Dennis and Kasia together too. They both came to just a clear resolution on God's leading for their marriage.
Yeah, and if we're going to link to an article in the show notes that has the photographs and so on from that year following Betty's death, and when Dennis was being a single parent with the kids. And I'll tell you, it's just, I don't think I would open myself up that vulnerable, but at the same time, Dennis knew and he sensed that God was doing something incredible even in the midst of this loss and the suffering that they went through. And so anyway, Dennis agreed to that. But yeah, we'll link to that, and be sure and open that up and take a look at that, because it tells the story in words and pictures, and it's very moving.
Yeah, and I was just super encouraged, just as we interviewed them, how they both just have built a life together since that loss. And what are they doing today? We didn't get to clarify that.
Yeah. Well, since we have known them, they were still on Crusade staff in Budapest when we knew them, and our family was living in Budapest too. And then since then they transitioned, and they're still with Crusade, but it's they're doing FamilyLife Today, which is a marriage and family ministry that's part of Campus Crusade, or Cru. I guess I need to learn to say that. Anyway, so they're traveling a lot in Central and Eastern Europe, doing doing marriage seminars and family training, parenting kind of things. And so they've been doing that for the last several years and have had a very fruitful ministry doing that. Of course, everyone's locked down with COVID now, and so they can't travel the remainder of 2020, and so they're doing what they can from their home in Ohio now, and enjoying, I think, being back, but probably definitely frustrated that they can't be there and doing the hands-on ministry.
Yeah, but God prepared them with the loss, and then the remarriage for Dennis, and parenting, adopting children, like just all that. Their story just has, God has uniquely placed them in a position of influence on a lot of families, and what an amazing gift for them to be able to have clung to God's grace and goodness in the midst of hardship, and now be able to walk with other people who go through hard things, because missionaries aren't exempt from pain and suffering. And I think that's another thing that was just a good reminder with their story, is that just because someone chooses to serve God in ministry or missions doesn't exclude us from the suffering of this world and the pain of this world. But God is still faithful.
Yeah, and I think we heard that come through crystal clear in this, that even in the midst of all this, I mean, Dennis knew God was with him in his pain and with him in all this, in the confusion and misunderstanding. And I just keep thinking back in my mind, the mental picture of him having lost Betty, traveling back to the States, having 3 memorial services, bearing your wife of 9 years, and then just trying to put your life back together and making that decision to return to Poland to do ministry. But how God was faithful, and God sustained Dennis and sustained them as a family. And it was just, it's a very moving story, and I hope you just enjoyed that conversation.
Yeah, well, we hope you're encouraged, and that we would all remain faithful. And trusting our God who is faithful. Yeah.
And if you find yourself in a situation or circumstance where you just feel overwhelmed, could you just email us at Steve at Sanctuary Inn or Cara at sanctuaryinn.org, and we're available. We're available to listen. We're available just to have a conversation online, and
or help you find the resources.
Or help you find a resource for someone, because we do have resources literally around the world, people that we could connect you with that could help you walk through a hard situation or hard circumstance.
Yes. Hey, blessings on you.
Thank you very much. And again, this is Steve and Cara with the Innkeepers podcast. Thank you for tuning in to the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers for kingdom purposes. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, and maybe you were prompted to pass this along to someone you know that will benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy schedules to help us learn more about missionary care.
We also want to thank Tim Downing for the music that he wrote and performed specifically for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can learn more about him and his work at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos and is produced by Tim Cowley of Cowley Visuals. If you have media needs, including film, photography, or audio, you can reach Tim at cowleyvisuals.com.
Our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Gibbons, Kara's amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website and learn more about the ministry of Sanctuary Inn at sanctuaryinn.org. Thank you again for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.
See you next time.